Well, our thanks as always to Home Street Bank for their support of this podcast. If you're looking for a bank that has it all, great people, great service, great rates, this is the place for you. This is my lender of choice. It should be yours as well. Go to homestreetbank.com. It's your one-stop shop for all your banking needs, both business and personal. That's homestreetbank.com. Do customers really understand how they make their own purchase decisions? Not really, no. Let's discuss today on The Buyer's Mind.
Welcome to The Buyer's Mind, where we take a closer look deep inside your customer's decision-making mechanism to reverse engineer the perfect sales presentation. Now, please welcome your host, Jeff Shore.
Well, welcome everyone once again to The Buyer's Mind, where we dive in to understand how our customers make purchase decisions. If we really understand the way that our customer wants to buy anyway, then we can reverse engineer our sales presentation to make it easy for them to do that. And today we've got one of the most interesting guests that we have ever had on The Buyer's Mind. Martin Lindstrom is just an amazing researcher, a great thinker, and some very, very fascinating points to be made. You're going to want to listen to this episode twice, I suspect. The research continues to fascinate, and a big part of that research tells us that the buying decision is so much more complex than we believe that it is. Murph, does it bother you to think that your non-conscious brain is way more in control of your buying decisions than your conscious brain?
I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. My unconscious brain was unconscious.
Let me.
It's one of these things where we've talked about System 1, System 2, and trying to get our heads wrapped around how much that kind of automatic pieces of our brain, that System 1 side, is doing so much thinking for us that we don't even realize when it's going on, right? Yeah, I think it's been just learning with you here on the show, even just how amazing that whole system works, and that takes over sometimes.
It really does. We get that sense, that emotion. We get a dopamine rush that propels us forward, and then suddenly our brain is just cranking out a story to try and justify why we want to move forward, why this is so attractive to us. But it happens on a non-conscious level. And you're going to hear this from Martin Lindstrom today, that so much of that decision is non-conscious. I think it's best if we acknowledge that, if we are aware of that, and then if we are prepared to help our customer to justify that. In other words, how do we help our customer do what they want to do anyway? And I had an opportunity recently to moderate a focus group of prospects for a client, and the unspoken message was so evident. These are emotional creatures making emotional decisions. The problem is that the product-centered sales pitch is not emotional at all. It's all facts and features and data. And I believe it's time to harness the power of the customer's emotion. And let me just make sure that I'm clear on that. When we talk about emotion, we're not talking about that drippy, sappy, hand me a Kleenex. If I'm not a little weepy in the presentation, that I'm not tapping the emotion. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about that part of our soul that really has no language, but it's how we feel much more than how we think. So, for example, if I ask you to describe, for those of you who are parents, if I ask you to describe your children, just tell me about your child. And if you said, certainly, her name is Mary Sue. She was born on July 28th in 2008. She was born at 4:23 a.m. at Washington Unified Hospital. The attending physician was Dr. John Steele. Her APGAR score was a 4.2. If that's the way you're describing your child, we got a problem. We got a problem. And that's not the way you're going to do it. When you think about your own children, how do you think of them? You think of them emotionally, good or bad. That's what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the idea of tapping into that deep sense of a customer's soul. So let me offer you our quote of the day from Reggie Ray. This is a great quote. He says, "Underneath it all, we are wild and we know it." Underneath it all, we are wild and we know it. We are emotional creatures. And deep down, we know that's true. And really, how boring would life be otherwise? So let me just give you a sales tip to complement that. And that is for you as a salesperson to set the emotional tone. It's very important for you to understand this. It is impossible for a customer to outpace the emotion of the salesperson. If the salesperson is emotionally low-key, that customer will be in that same place. Okay? And so that customer is going to take their cue from you. When you appropriately show your own conviction, your own desire, your own soul, you give permission to the customer to do the same. And I remember once I was shopping for a necktie, and the salesperson at Nordstrom said, "Oh, I own that tie. I got to tell you, I just feel good every time I put it on." Now, it wasn't salesy, or at least it didn't come off as salesy. He was speaking from the heart. He clearly liked this tie, and he felt good when he put it on. That is a wonderful thing called emotional transference. How do we take the positive emotion that we already feel and hand it over to our customer? Your job as a sales professional is to set the emotional tone. Well, we are joined now by Dr. Martin Lindstrom. He is the author of the book Buyology, B-U-Y-ology, and one of the great marketing minds of our day. He's a diligent researcher, prolific writer, and a profound branding consultant. Also a recipient of Time Magazine's World's 100 Most Influential People. Joining us from Minneapolis today, Martin Lindstrom. Martin, how are you today?
Fantastic. How are you doing?
Good. You've just got this amazing body of work. Let me just start here. At the end of your career, several decades from now, what do you hope to be known for?
I hope I'll be well known for one thing. That is that I put the customer back into the center of everything we do. I think what has happened in big corporations and with brands is that we've become incredibly arrogant over the years. And as a consequence of that, we've sort of created our own little ecosystem where we are more busy serving ourselves in corporations than actually serving the customer. And that distance has become so extreme right now that a lot of companies are struggling to survive. What I'm trying to do is to be the advocate for the consumer and put them in the center of every organization so people truly think their minds and actually almost act as they are a customer themselves. And there's a long way to go, but that's my hope.
I love it. I mean, I work so much on the sales side of the business. I work with a lot of frontline sales professionals, and I find that it's true in marketing, which is your specialty, but it obviously reaches over into the sales arena as well, because even corporations have looked at it and said, we want you, salesperson, to talk about this aspect of the product, and we did this research about how this should work. But they sort of forget to put the customer first. So it seems pervasive. It's not just in marketing. It's also in the very conversations that salespeople tend to have. It's a product first. It's a company first. And somehow we forgot about putting the customer first.
Well, absolutely. What I tend to say is like this. In the old days, we would have a set of KPIs which would measure our performance. Mm-hmm. So we will be on the top, the company running the show, and then we'll have in the end of that whole interaction, we'll have the customer and deal with them. Then what happened was that as a lot of companies were listed, they went on the stock exchange and stuff like that, they had to infuse transparency into the market, report much more frequently, tell the leaders about what the progress is of the business. So they had to break down those KPIs into small KPIs. Mm-hmm. And that was good for a while because it all span out of one overall direction. But then what happened is that each of those KPIs were optimized more and more and more. And suddenly they became their own little ecosystem, pleasing themselves. The department was pleasing itself. That division was pleasing itself. But they increasingly forgot about the customer. And suddenly it's all over the place. It's almost like we have to stop now, put a line in the sand and go back and say, how do we infuse that customer mindset across the whole organization, across the KPIs, so it really is back in the driver's seat? Because right now, companies are lip-syncing when they say they are customer-focused. That's the reason why the McDonald's and the Crafts and whoever it is out there are struggling, because they, in the end of the day, do not understand the customer. They say they do, but when push comes to shove, they don't.
I often advise my clients that if you're having a meeting and you're talking about all your different metrics, your KPIs, your key performance indicators, and certainly the policies that are going to come out of that, it would be very wise to, at the very least, have an empty chair in the room that symbolizes or represents what type of conversation would we be having right now if one of our customers was sitting right here. I think there's a lot of I think this and I think that without a lot of at least even a nod of the head to the customer in the room.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. And I think the issue right now is that when I speak to customers around the world, they all claim they know the customer very well because they're out with them and they visit them and they sell to them. But there's a huge difference from me selling to you than actually just sitting down and listening to what your life is like and what your worldview is like. Very few clients are doing that. They think they can measure things through a remote control. And I tend to say to people, how many do you know when they're just about to be married, pulled out a Excel Microsoft spreadsheet and did a little bit of an evaluation or due diligence of the wife or the husband, right? I mean, that's a little bit the way we're measuring our clients and believe we understand the client. And that we have to get out of that. And I think the issue we have right now is that big data in many ways are paralyzing organizations because they think this is the holy grail of answers. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because if it was, how come when you and I want to meet, we really want to meet in person? How come that physical interaction still is there? That's because there's something else. And that something else we want to bottle and make part of the brand, right?
You've done so much research. You're a prolific speaker and author, but you've done so much research. You've collaborated with so many of the world's greatest thinkers. What do you consider to be some of the top highlights for all the research that you've done? When you look back on it, this was either most enjoyable to you or where you felt this had the greatest level of impact?
Well, I think on a personal note, that the most important piece of research I probably have done span out of biology some years ago. Unfortunately, my mom passed away from cancer some years ago, and she did that because she was a heavy smoker. And I promised her before she passed away that I would make a revenge on the tobacco industry. And my revenge in many ways was to do the largest neuroscience study in the world where we scanned 2,000 consumers' brains using fMRI. And as part of that study, I had an hypothesis. My hypotheses were that the health warnings on cigarette packs actually have the reverse effect. So when you read it, it actually encourages you to smoke even more. And it was a strange hypothesis, I know, but it has its ground in the idea of that these health warnings in fact, almost became brands themselves. When people saw that, it was linked to the Pavlov's dogs effect. And suddenly people just felt that sense of craving. So we initiated this study, and we came up with a very simple conclusion using fMRI that, in fact, it was true that the health warnings have a reversed effect. In fact, the very concept of subliminal advertising indeed exists. So as a consequence of that, we changed the health warning labels across the world, and you will see that in Europe. You will see that in Canada and Australia, and you will very soon see it here in the United States, that the surgeon's health warning will disappear and it will be replaced with other techniques we've learned out of this study. So that was one thing which I felt had a huge impact on not just my knowledge and understanding of the power of brand and subconscious communication, but also made the tobacco industry really step back.
Let me insert here, because I want to ask you to think about your thinking here for just a moment. If you take yourself all the way back, it seems completely counterintuitive for you to even consider that this message here, this Surgeon General's warning or whatever it was in different countries, that this message that smoking could kill you, it seems counterintuitive to believe that that would have a reverse effect. What was it that caused you to look at it and say, I don't think this is helping? If you can go back to the origin of that thought, what triggered that contemplation?
Well, it's fascinating you asking that question, because that is probably my point number two. That is what I call small data. So small data is what we call seemingly insignificant observations you make in people's lives. And when you see those observations and you really detect it, it actually can create the foundation for a new brand or a new product or a new service. Because quite often what I look for is where we're out of balances in our lives. And we can see that in the way people dress, the way you sit, the way you stack your fridge, the way you place your shoes at the hall entrance, the way you brush your teeth. All of those elements is what we call small data. And actually, I picked up small data, and I did that in 1995, where I observed my mom smoking. And I noticed a couple of things. One thing I noticed was when there was no ashtrays around, she smoked less. Not because it was inconvenient, but because the ashtray in itself actually was almost like a broadcast station for smoking. It's almost like it reminded her to smoke. And I realized that later on, when I checked into a hotel room many years later, and in the room, I had no craving for chocolate. But when I went into the room, they had these round, colorful circles on the floor. And immediately I got that sense of I wanted to have an M&M's chocolate. And I was so puzzled about why did I get that craving, and realized the subconscious message was really strong. So I started to look at health warnings. And whenever I noticed a smoker smoking, I would see that they actually quite often will notice the health warnings first, and that will make them crave. I could see that actually they wanted to smoke more in the body language, the way they're fiddling around with their pens, all that stuff. So the hypothesis actually came from small data, and I verified that using fMRI. And I think this is really the issue here. The issue is in our world today that we do not observe anymore. We believe we can see everything from numbers. But the biggest and most important role for a marketeer is to wake up. You know, I don't have a smartphone and I don't have a phone, period. And I don't have a phone because it makes me detached from the world. It stops my creativity, because here's the issue. You don't see anything anymore. You don't meet people anymore. And most importantly, you never get bored anymore. And boredom is the foundation for creativity. So the issue is a lot of marketeers are so busy on their phones that don't see the world anymore, and they don't observe consumer behavior anymore because we're too busy in our offices producing PowerPoint presentation and reports. So our biggest and most important role is to get into the real world, live with consumers, and spend time in their homes, and then observe the small data and use that as a foundation for a hypothesis, which can create a point of differentiation for a brand.
Just absolutely fascinating stuff. We're talking to Dr. Martin Lindstrom. We will post a link to your Fast Company article, how your low tolerance for boredom might be making you less creative. I actually read that this morning, Martin, and I have to tell you, I was immediately convicted, because I am one of those people. Yesterday, I was in San Antonio. I was traveling back to California, and I know that every moment I had to be looking at something. I had to be fidgeting with something, but the idea that boredom is the prerequisite to creativity was it really stung me. So, but in a happy way. Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
I want to talk about the book Biology, Truth and Lies About the Way We Buy. The book was based on extensive and revealing research about the way we make purchase decisions. What was it that really caused you to want to write that book in the first place?
Well, I wrote a book prior to Biology called Small Data. In the book, I really launched the whole idea about sensory marketing or sensory branding. The idea of that we, in the future, will use all 5 senses, or as many senses as we can, to convey a brand message. Back then, when the book was written, very few companies, if any, were using the senses. We all had that somewhat narrow view of the world that if I communicate to a person, sound and visuals effect is enough. But I have the fundamental view that the more tracks you record a message on, i.e. 5 tracks, i.e. the senses, the more we remember things. So we conducted this major study in partnership with a company called Milner Brown, where we analyzed consumers across 17 countries. But in that process, I realized that when I asked people about how much more craving do you generate when you hold a Contour classic Coca-Cola glass bottle in your hand, how much more craving do you feel? It was incredibly hard for people to articulate. And I realized when I said to people, when you sit in a car, what memories come to mind? It was difficult for people to sort of express what they felt. So there were some limits for how you can ask people questions. And in fact, those limits, I thought, could be broken by looking straight into our brain. So what I did was to team up with a group of scientists and I asked them, is it possible to do different techniques of looking into our brain using fMRI or SST or EEG or other methodologies. And they said, yeah, it's never been done before, but why don't we try it? And that then became the foundation for biology. So it really was a way for me to understand the impact of our senses in particular. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the conclusion was, when we did biology and the whole study was done, that in fact the senses have an enormous impact. In fact, the sense of smell is by far the most important sense we have, much stronger than sight and sound. And in fact, if you add 2 senses to your marketing effort, it will increase your effect or impact with 30%. If I have 3 senses added to the whole game, you're doubling the impact of your brand message. Now, no one has seen that before, and that really became the foundation for biology and the work we did there.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that when you look at the brain's processing center, 50% or more than 50% of the processing of the senses is dedicated to sight alone. I believe that's I could be wrong on that, but I think that's what the statistic says. So why is it that smell is more powerful than sight and sound in the influence?
Well, it's very simple why. We have to go back to the reptile brain. Mm-hmm. And back when we were, let's say, monkeys some 100,000 of years ago, back in those days, what happened was that we were on planet Earth to survive. And the survival instinct came through in a different way. And I want to give you an example. If you close your eyes, and if everyone listening to this show, close your eyes. Do me that favor. Just close your eyes right now.
Okay.
And let's think about when you went back to school and you had these blackboards in front of you. Now take your long nails and scratch them down those blackboards. Mm-hmm. Can you feel that uncomfortable feeling?
Yes.
Now you can open your eyes again. Why do we feel uncomfortable? We feel uncomfortable because of that sound, but I never played the sound for you. So what happens? Well, here's the issue. When we were monkeys and there would be a danger, a monkey would scream. And this frequency of that scream is exactly the same frequency as the frequency of when you scratch your nails down the blackboard. Mm-hmm. So this is a hardwired behavior into our reptile brain. And still today, 100,000 years later, we still are behaving that way. Now, that comes back to the power of our senses. The reason why we have a nose and a nose in front of our mouth is because the first thing we do when things are going into our mouth is to smell it. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why the nose is above the mouth. Mm-hmm. And in the old days, of course, you would have berries and you will smell it before putting it into your mouth because it may be or maybe showing that you're alive. So smell is the only sense which are bypassing the rational part of our brain and going straight to the emotional center. So if I expose you for smell, and it's a wonderful smell of freshly brewed coffee, and I tell you this is manipulated, I'm doing it to make you buy more coffee, mm-hmm. you will say to me, oh yeah, I know, but I really want to have a cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. But if I show you a picture, your rational part of the brain is able to kick in and save you because it goes through the rationalization of the emotion you will have before you have the emotion. So it may be that 50% of our brain is dedicated to the visual sense, but at the end of the day, it's emotions driving us. Mm-hmm. Emotion drives everything of our behavior because we know today from the biology study that around 85% of everything I do today is subconscious. I'm not aware of it. And I'll give you an example. I mean, think about this. When you sit at home and you have a remote control and it's flat for batteries, are you then the type of person which is squeezing extra hard on the bottoms to squeeze the last drop of battery out of it? You probably are. Mm-hmm. Now, is that rational or irrational? Of course it's irrational. Right. And I don't need to tell you it doesn't work. You'll continue doing it. You'll continue knocking on wood or touch wood. Mm-hmm. Even though you know it doesn't work, you'll continue doing it. So 85% of what we do is irrational. That means that's the emotion you tap into, and smell is tapping straight into that space. So yes, it may be the brain is 50% of the space for visual, but it's still not ruling our behavior.
You know, it's really interesting. It must drive you a little crazy as a researcher here. I'm getting a sense of how much the idea of somebody in a boardroom somewhere making a decision without the research, it must drive you nuts. Because I remember when I first read Paco Underhill's book, Why We Buy, and the thought of him and his team watching hours and hours and hours of videotape, just watching people walk through a department store and just seeing the foot patterns and where the eyes went and everything. The research is hard. The research is difficult. The research is grueling, and yet, from what I'm hearing from you right here, if you don't do that, then you're going to rely on your gut. And the problem is that from a marketer's perspective, their gut is irrational as well. So we're making decisions out of our own subconscious about our customer's subconscious. It's probably not going to work.
Yeah, and this is the biggest challenge a marketeer today is witnessing, because I think the reason why marketing folks across the world are in such a big crisis as they are is because everything has been rationalized through the digital space. So we believe we can measure everything, and we believe everything has an immediate impact. But you can't measure love. And the issue is right now we believe we can. So when a marketeer is trying to push through a message in an organization, he or she is immediately asked to show the results up front, give a guarantee, and constantly measure the impact. And that's fine in some aspect of your work. But it's incredibly dangerous if everything can be measured to that degree, because nothing is short-term. There's a lot of things which have a long-term impact, and organizations today do not have the patience for that. So the most important thing you can do is, and this is probably the most important advice to everyone today, that is you have to infuse empathy into the decision makers. And how do you do that? Well, what we do when we work with the largest brands around the world to transform organizations and cultures and brands is that we take the business people, the clients, with us into the homes of consumers. We literally have them sitting next to us. And then we show them firsthand a side of the consumer you've never seen before in your life. You see emotions you've never seen, and dreams and hopes. And suddenly one day you'll notice the client actually starts to feel empathy. They start to be able to think like the customer. And when they then go back and they can convince the CEO to do the same exercise of being in the homes of consumers, then suddenly you will notice that they actually are willing to gamble a little bit more. And that gamble means to say, well, why don't we just take 70% on a measurable scale, and 30% we believe is long-term, but we can't measure it straight away because that's our investment in the future. And then after some while, you then can prove that actually kind of it works. And then you can transform the organization back to where it belongs to. Because right now, the pendulums has swung too much to the irrational part in every aspect of the organization. And people are not happy there. The customers are not happy, and we lost the focus. And that has to swing back again. And I believe it's the marketeer's role to become the advocate of these customer and push that transformation into the organization, because the organization simply cannot do it on its own.
I had a conference that I held recently for a number of about 300 sales executives, and they were all in the home building industry. We brought in 4 individuals or couples who had recently purchased a home and asked them about their journey. And the one thing that I did there was I was not bashful about asking them to share the emotional part of their journey. And I got to tell you, it was not difficult to get them to open up. They wanted to tell the story, and it was the highlight of the entire conference. And it really struck a chord with me to say, you're not doing this, are you? You're not actually finding that empathy. I love the idea of actually going into the home of a customer and seeing the way they think and having that very real conversation. In your findings, you talked about the role of emotion in the purchase decision and how emotional we are. We think we're logical. We're really not. But can you talk a little about how emotion and logic work together in a purchase decision?
Well, yes. So there's sort of 3 different stages. I think the first stage is that because we increasingly are so busy in our everyday life and we allocate less and less time to explore new opportunities out of the screen, we need to ride on existing awareness already established in our brain. Now, first of all, let me just put this into perspective. Today, out of the entire time of span we are awake, as a teenager or as a millennial, you'll notice that we spend 9 hours on a screen of our free time. It's not for work, it's after work, 9 hours. We are feeding ourselves with a constant stream of never-ending content, which are somewhat paralyzing ourselves, or certainly entertaining ourselves so much that we rarely can let our eyes wander away from the screen. And that is a huge challenge when you want people to buy stuff in a supermarket. So the first thing we have to do is to create some sort of awareness in the supermarket. So that decision you make when you look up from the screen and you have perhaps 10 seconds to make up your mind what brand to buy, that you actually already have established awareness. And as you know from old statistics, we have about 1.5 seconds to survive that test. Mm-hmm. That awareness is incredibly important, and that is subconscious. The second thing is we now want to verify that the decision we made is right, because we want to justify that when we come home to our house, to our wife or husband, or we want to be seen as cool or good buyer, or we want to have arguments to our friends and family to explain why we bought this thing here. That is the rational part which are kicking in. And then the last part which are kicking in is then at that stage where I get a self-fulfilling feeling. That is where the dopamine kicks in, where I put it into my shopping cart, and I kind of feel, I feel good about that. Mm-hmm. It gets a release of dopamine. That is pure subconscious again. If you break down this entire process, you will see, again, 85% of the entire journey for me to make the decision and buy the product is subconscious, and 15% is rational. And it really does not change a lot in a supermarket setting or when you buy clothes or perfume. Where it really changes, of course, is certain other industries which are very commodity-driven. But in general, this is the rule of thumb. And this is what's so ironic, because most people today believe it's almost the opposite, and nothing could be further from the truth. It doesn't matter if the purchases are really extensive, something you've been thinking about for a long, say a home or a car or a $10,000 engagement ring that's really going to set you back. Are we still in that same balance of 85%, 15%? Yeah, it actually is. If you take when I buy a car, for example, you will notice that 59% of all cars purchased today in the United States, those decisions are made by the kids at home under the age of 12. I mean, that's a crazy number, isn't it? And this is based on one of the largest studies we did ever, again with Miller Brown, where we asked not just people in the U.S., but across the world for one of my books called Brainchild. Mm-hmm. And it is the case with certain electronic goods and cars, because parents have very little insight about what is a cool car, what's not a cool car, what's the cool electronics, what's not. So they rely increasingly on kids because they're the gateway to new technology. So a lot of categories which may not be obvious actually is heavily influenced by kids. And I would call that a very irrational behavior to ask your kid what car you should buy. Mm-hmm. In particular, when you're driving to work back and forth every day and the kid is not in the car. So yes, you will see this is the case across many different categories. We're just about out of time. Tell us, if you can, briefly about mirror neurons. Well, mirror neurons really comes back to the conversation we had a couple of minutes ago regarding you closing your eyes and me scratching my nails down the blackboard and you feel very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Mirror neurons is what's called also monkey see, monkey do. It was invented in Parma in Italy. And the idea was really that when I make a person imagine a certain movement, I actually feel I'm doing it, and it activates exactly the same areas in the brain as if I was doing it just by imagining it. Mirror neurons are really important because that plugs into a lot of aspects in branding and marketing, that if I'm able to make the person imagine things, it really transforms my behavior. And the best way for me to illustrate that is with another study I write a lot about in my last book, Small Data, called embodied cognition. There's a study where people were basically asked to put on a lab coat, a white lab coat. And they had three different options. One lab coat where it said doctor above, one where it said dentist above, and one where it said nothing. And when people put on the doctor's lab coat, they felt more intelligent, they were faster at asking questions, they had more self-esteem. In fact, they basically outperformed any of the other scenarios because of an emotional transformation. This is, in many ways, a variation of neurons, because the idea is very simple, that I feel things which is perceived into my mind, and suddenly I embed or take those powers on board. And I don't need to tell you that's the essence of what brands is all about. If I feel more popular when I wear that perfume, or feel healthier when I eat those vitamins, or I feel I'm more sexy when I drive that car, well, then the brand has achieved its goal. And this comes back to some of the foundational values on neurons and on embodied cognition, right?
Fascinating. Just amazingly insightful stuff. It seems to me that this is a good time for Martin Lindstrom to be alive, right? When you look at what we can see now into the brain and the way the brain works scientifically, but then also you look at the evolution, the continuing evolution, the explosion really of behavioral economics. It seems like it's a good time to be Martin Lindstrom.
Well, listen, thank you for that. I actually agree. This is incredibly fascinating. We live in a world which is changing so much. And as I tend to say, things have never gone so fast before, and they'll never go that slow again. Mm-hmm.
It's a great final insight. Martin Lindstrom is his name. MartinLindstrom.com is the website. We'll put that in the show notes. Go buy the book, Biology, Truth and Lies About Why We Buy. It is fascinating. Martin Lindstrom, can't thank you enough. Thanks for being on The Buyer's Mind.
You're most welcome.
Well, Murph, you can see why I wanted to have Martin Lindstrom on the show. I mean, this guy, he's an advocate for the very things that we believe in and talk about so much here on The Buyer's Mind. I think we could classify him as the perfect guest, yes?
Pretty much the perfect guest. I thought it was interesting, some of the banter that you guys had back and forth and your take on the fact that marketing people sometimes end up relying on their gut instead of the research. And I was fascinated by that because we end up in kind of a whole bias there that gets us into a lot of trouble.
But I guess I've seen that all throughout my career. I mean, I've hung around with sales and marketing executives through my entire career, and I see that over and over again. It's called the I think syndrome. And when you start saying, I think the customer thinks this, it's, as Martin Lindstrom talked about, it's that game of telephone that sort of separates us a little bit, and we kind of forget. And I just, if you put on your consumer's hat for a moment, Murph, I think if a consumer were actually listening to this interview and listening to Martin Lindstrom, they would probably be sitting there going, thank you very much. Somebody actually cares what I think.
As a consumer, I wish somebody would care about what I think, and I wish that those questions would get asked a little bit more, and it's unfortunate that they don't.
Yeah. As
Dr. Lindstrom was talking about how we experience things, and he made us close our eyes. The nails on the chalkboard, God, that's like the worst sound ever.
Yeah, right.
In our heads. But I don't know. How did it make you feel when he talked about the fact of us being monkeys?
Well, I didn't want to get into certainly a theological debate. I am an intelligent design guy. I believe that we were created by God and did not evolve from monkeys. But that said, I understood his point. I understood what he was trying to connect it through. If you come at it from that worldview that we evolved out of monkeys, then everything's going to be easily tracked back to it. I do think that from my perspective, again, disagreeing with the idea that we evolved from monkeys, I still think I could go back to a time when our primitive brains were absolutely designed to keep us alive and to be very responsive to the things that were going on around us. So, I recognize that we might have different worldviews on it, but it doesn't make the point invalid. We have leftover brains, right, from a different age and from a different time, and I think we need to understand how our brains work and how they were originally wired as simply a survival instinct to keep us alive. I love to, and again, we're going to put in the show notes a link to the Fast Company article, how your low tolerance for boredom might be making you less creative. Again, I read that this very morning. I was extremely convicted because I don't do boredom well. I feel like I'm always having to move from this device to that device, and it's not healthy. It's just not healthy. But I just want to use that as an encouragement for all of you. Read the article and see what you find. But I think the main thing for me as I'm looking at it is to recognize that over and over again, we tend to want to make decisions according to our biases and our influences. And if we are in sales and marketing, we have something to sell, right? That's just the nature of what it is that we do. We have something to sell. And the fact that we have something to sell, that we are charged with selling something, we are deemed successful when we sell something. If we are not consciously keeping the customer's perspective in mind, then our own bias, our own agenda will skew things, and we will think that what we are doing is in the customer's best interest, but there's something there that says, I need the sale, I've got to hit my numbers, I need the commission, whatever it's going to be. So I just want to encourage you as a key takeaway for what we heard from Dr. Lindstrom today is that we have to more and more wear the hat of the customer to understand the customer. That's why I want to encourage you to read books like Biology, because it'll give you a peek into the customer's mind and allow you to say, boy, can I reverse engineer the way that I need to sell according to the way that my customer really, really wants to buy. Along the lines, too, it'll probably make you a better consumer when you understand yourself, when you recognize that 85% of your purchase decisions are emotional and non-conscious, only 15% is rational. And we don't want to be manipulative here in the way that we sell, but we certainly do want to be smarter about it. I have to tell you, I love doing the buyer's mind. I really do. And one of the reasons why I love it is because I get to have conversations with people like Dr. Martin Lindstrom. It opens my mind. It expands my horizon. It makes me a better professional because I really can get to the point where I'm thinking beyond just my own limited perspective. I find that if I only rely on what I already know, I don't grow, and I can't help others to grow along the same lines. And so I just want to encourage you just to continually open your mind, to continually expand the ways that you are thinking in order to serve people better, to understand people better, to have empathy for people on a more effective level, and to really have the opportunity ultimately at the end of the day to change their world. Well, there you go. Another episode of The Buyer's Mind. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you subscribe to that. Would really appreciate that. Leave a review if you wouldn't mind too. But that's another wrap on our podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find everything you need at jeffshore.com. But until next time, my friends, go out there and change someone's world.